It wasn't supposed to happen. It was just an awkward, fleeting moment, one I could easily explain away. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The movie theater was dark, and Chloe had begged me to tag along with her and James, her boyfriend of 6 months. She claimed it would be fun, a way for me to get out of the house, but I knew better. She thought I was lonely, and maybe I was. When we got there, the seats were scattered. Chloe ended up a row behind us, chatting with a coworker she'd bumped into while James and I found seats near the center. I was about to settle into the seat beside him when someone brushed past, claiming the spot. "Just sit here," James said, patting his lap with an easy grin. I froze. "It's fine," he added quickly, lowering his voice. "Just until Chloe gets here." I hesitated for a beat too long, my heart racing, but I told myself it was harmless. It was dark, no one would notice, and besides it was just a seat, so I sat. I didn't think it would mean anything. But the second I felt his hands lightly resting on my hips to steady me, my body betrayed me. His touch was casual, but the heat of it lingered through the thin fabric of my dress. The movie started, but I couldn't focus. My breathing felt uneven, and my pulse was loud in my ears, drowning out the dialogue on screen. When Chloe finally shuffled down the aisle, squeezing into the seat next to me, I practically leapt off James's lap, mumbling some excuse about saving his spot. If she noticed anything odd, she didn't show it. But James did. I caught his eyes during the movie, and he didn't look away. That moment should have been nothing, a mistake we'd laugh about later. But the way his gaze lingered told me we'd crossed a line I wasn't sure we could uncross. The incident at the movie theater stayed with me far longer than it should have. It wasn't just the moment itself, awkward as it was what it revealed. James wasn't just my daughter's boyfriend anymore. He had a presence, a pull, that made it impossible for me to look at him the same way again. And worse, I knew he felt it too. It's strange, isn't it? How something so simple can spiral into something much bigger. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night after the movie, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heat of his hands on my hips, the firmness of his thighs beneath me, and the quiet intensity in his gaze. When I finally drifted off, it was morning before I knew it. I woke up groggy, annoyed at myself for dwelling on it. But when I walked into the kitchen and found James standing there, pouring coffee like he'd always belonged in my house, all those feelings came rushing back. He looked up, catching my eye, and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small quirk of his lips, but it was enough to set my pulse racing. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, casual. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a mug and busying myself with the coffee pot. I tried to act normal, like my skin wasn't prickling under his gaze. "Chloe's still asleep," he said, leaning against the counter. "Late night," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. "Yeah," he said, and then, after a pause, "You okay? You seem distracted." I froze, gripping the mug a little tighter than necessary. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He didn't push it, but I could feel his eyes on me as I left the kitchen. James had started dating Chloe 6 months ago. She'd met him at some networking event for young professionals. Her words, not mine. Chloe was ambitious, sharp, and as confident as you'd expect a 22-year-old fresh out of college to be. When she brought James home for the first time, I was surprised. He was older than most of the boys she'd dated, 25, polished and charming in a way that felt effortless. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, who could make you laugh without trying too hard. I liked him immediately. Too much, maybe. At first, I brushed it off. Of course I liked him. He was polite, respectful, and clearly smitten with my daughter. But as time went on, I started noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his hand would linger on mine when he passed me something at the dinner table. The way his eyes seemed to find me across the room, holding my gaze just a second longer than they should. The way his compliments, always polite and casual, felt like they carried an undertone, meant just for me. "Mrs. Rains, I can't believe you're Chloe's mom," he'd said once, laughing as he helped me clear the table after dinner. "You don't look old enough to have a daughter her age." I'd laughed it off, calling him a charmer, but my cheeks had burned. I told myself it was harmless. Flirting, if you could even call it that, didn't mean anything. He was young, confident, of course he was friendly. But deep down, I knew there was something more. And then there was the movie night. After that, everything changed. A week after the theater incident, Chloe asked me to let James in while she ran late from work. It was a rainy evening, and when the doorbell rang, I found him standing there, his dark hair slick with rain, and his coat dripping on the porch. "Sorry," he said, flashing me that easy smile. "Didn't mean to interrupt your evening." "It's fine," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged off his coat, handing it to me, and for a moment his fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, just a small touch, but it felt like a spark had shot up my arm. "You can wait in the living room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Chloe should be back soon." Instead, he followed me into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I poured myself a glass of wine. "Want one?" I asked, holding up the bottle. "Sure," he said, his voice low. I handed him the glass, and he held it up in a mock toast. "To awkward movie nights," he said, smirking. I nearly choked on my sip. "Don't," I said, laughing despite myself. "What?" he asked, feigning innocence. "It's a funny memory." "It's embarrassing," I said, shaking my head. "For who?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I didn't answer, and he didn't push. But as he took a sip of his wine, his eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I knew I should have walked away, made an excuse to leave the room. But I didn't. I stayed, leaning against the counter across from him, the silence between us crackling with tension. "You're different from most people I've met," he said suddenly, his voice soft. I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. You carry yourself differently, like you know exactly who you are." The compliment caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I guess that comes with age," I said finally, trying to brush it off. "Maybe," he said, his gaze steady. "But I think it's more than that." My heart was pounding, and I hated how much his words affected me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, barely more than a touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, staring at him, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. "James," I started, my voice trembling, but the sound of Chloe's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment like a snap. He pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable, and I turned away, busying myself with the wine bottle as Chloe walked in, calling out a cheerful hello. That moment should have been a warning, a sign to put distance between us before it was too late. But instead, it became the first crack in the wall I'd spent years building. I don't know exactly when the line blurred. Maybe it was that night in the kitchen, his hand brushing against mine, or the way he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. Or maybe it had been building for weeks. Unspoken tension, disguised as harmless glances and casual conversations. All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about him. The moment that truly changed everything happened the following Saturday. Chloe had gone out with friends for the evening, leaving the house unusually quiet. I'd settled on the couch with a glass of wine and an old movie, trying to enjoy the rare peace. I wasn't expecting James to stop by, but when the doorbell rang, there he was. "Chloe's not here," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "I know," he said, shrugging off his jacket. "She told me she'd be out, but I figured I'd drop by anyway. Didn't want you getting lonely." His smile was casual, but his tone wasn't. I told myself he was just being polite, that I was reading too much into it. But as he followed me into the living room, his presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. "Wine?" I asked, gesturing to the bottle on the coffee table. "Sure," he said, sinking onto the couch as if he'd done it 100 times before. I poured him a glass and sat down at the other end of the couch, leaving enough space between us to keep things neutral. At least, that was the plan. "What are you watching?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. "Some old noir film," I said. "Probably before your time." He laughed softly, his eyes flicking to mine. "You're not that much older than me." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm old enough to be your mother." "But you're not," he said, his voice low. The air between us shifted, the weight of his words settling over me. I should have changed the subject, made an excuse to leave the room, but I didn't. The movie played on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. He leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his gaze never leaving me. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you're different from anyone I've ever met." I laughed, trying to break the tension. "I'm sure Chloe would love to hear that." "I'm serious," he said, his tone soft but firm. You're confident. You know who you are. It's rare." I felt my cheeks flush and I looked away, swirling the wine in my glass. "You shouldn't say things like that," I murmured. "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. "Because it's inappropriate," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away, and when I finally looked at him, his face was inches from mine. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered. I froze, my heart pounding. "James, we can't." But before I could finish, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I couldn't. My glass slipped from my hand, landing on the carpet with a dull thud as I leaned into him, my hands gripping the front of his shirt. His touch was careful, almost reverent, and when he deepened the kiss, every rational thought vanished. "James," I whispered, breaking the kiss long enough to catch my breath. "This is..." "Don't," he said, his voice low and desperate. "Don't say it's wrong." But it was wrong, and we both knew it. That didn't stop me from pulling him closer. We didn't make it to the bedroom. The couch became our world, the flickering light of the TV casting shadows across his face as he kissed me like he'd been waiting for this moment forever. His hands explored my body with a mixture of confidence and hesitation, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person who mattered. When it was over, we lay there in silence, tangled together, the reality of what we'd done slowly sinking in. "I shouldn't have come," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't have." He turned to look at me, his expression soft but conflicted. "Do you want me to leave?" I hesitated, my heart aching. "I don't know." The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. The couch was empty, the wine glasses still sitting on the coffee table. I stared at the spot where he'd been, my mind racing. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that it wouldn't happen again, but deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and anticipation. I avoided Chloe as much as possible, afraid she'd see the truth written all over my face. But James? He was everywhere. He texted me late at night, his messages simple but loaded with meaning. "Thinking about you. Can't stop." I didn't respond at first, but the longer I resisted, the more I wanted to see him again. And then he showed up at my office. It was late, long after my coworkers had gone home. I was going over design plans for a new client when the door to my office creaked open. "James?" I said, startled. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice low. "You can't be here." I said, standing up. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because this is my workplace," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "And," he said, his eyes locking on mine. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hands finding my waist. "James, someone could." "They won't," he said, cutting me off with a kiss. That night, the small couch in my office became our refuge. The risk of being caught only heightened the intensity, and when he finally left, I sat there in the dark, my heart racing and my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I told myself it couldn't continue, that it was too dangerous, too reckless. But the next time he called, I didn't hesitate to answer. Once we crossed the line, there was no going back. It wasn't just a moment of weakness anymore. It was something much deeper, something neither of us could resist. James and I fell into a dangerous rhythm, one that blurred the lines between secrecy and obsession. We knew we were playing with fire, but every stolen moment made the flames burn brighter. It started with late-night visits to the house when Chloe wasn't home. He'd text me, something simple like, "Can I see you?" and within minutes, he'd be at the door. Each time felt riskier than the last, but the thrill of it only added to the intensity. One evening, Chloe had gone to a friend's birthday party, promising she wouldn't be home until late. James showed up an hour after she left, slipping through the back door like he belonged there. "You shouldn't keep doing this," I said as he stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain. "Neither should you," he replied, a sly grin tugging at his lips. He didn't wait for me to argue. He closed the distance between us, his hands finding my waist as he pressed me against the counter. The rain outside blurred the windows, the sound of it pounding against the glass, the only thing breaking the silence. "You make it impossible to stay away," he murmured, his lips brushing against my neck. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The places we met became more reckless. Once, we spent an afternoon in his car, parked in a secluded spot at the edge of town. The windows fogged as the summer heat made the air thick and sticky, but neither of us cared. Another time, we met at a boutique hotel on the outskirts of the city. I told Chloe I was meeting a client and left work early, my hands shaking as I walked into the lobby. James was waiting for me in the room, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, and the second the door closed behind me, all the tension melted into something electric. The room was small, intimate, and every sound felt amplified. The rustle of sheets, the soft gasps, the faint hum of the air conditioner, it was all-consuming. "You drive me crazy," he said afterward, his head resting against the pillow as he traced lazy circles on my arm. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to say what I was thinking, that I felt the same way. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep it hidden. Chloe started noticing the way James lingered at the house, how he always seemed to find a reason to stay longer than necessary. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, she made an offhand comment that sent a chill down my spine. "You two get along so well," she said, glancing between me and James. "Sometimes I think he likes you more than he likes me." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, but James didn't miss a beat. "She's just easy to talk to," he said smoothly, flashing Chloe a charming smile. "You should be glad your mom's so cool." Chloe laughed, brushing it off, but the comment lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't just Chloe who noticed. My best friend, Evelyn, started asking questions too. "You seem different lately," she said one afternoon as we sipped coffee at a cafe downtown. "Different how?" I asked, feigning ignorance. Evelyn tilted her head, studying me. "I don't know. Distracted. Like your mind is somewhere else." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "I think you're imagining things." "Am I?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. I avoided her gaze, focusing on the steam rising from my coffee. Evelyn didn't press further, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. The close calls started piling up, each one leaving my heart pounding and my nerves frayed. One night, after Chloe had gone to bed, James and I were sitting in the living room. The lights were dim, and we were perched on opposite ends of the couch, trying to maintain the illusion of distance. But when he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, the room seemed to shrink. I didn't hear Chloe coming down the stairs until it was too late. "What are you two still doing up?" she asked, yawning as she stepped into the room. "Just talking," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. James smiled, his composure flawless. "Your mom's got some interesting stories," he said, leaning back casually. Chloe didn't seem to notice the tension, but I excused myself shortly after, retreating to my bedroom with my heart pounding. The worst moment came one afternoon when Raymond, my ex-husband and Chloe's father, showed up unannounced. He'd been visiting from out of state and decided to surprise Chloe, but he caught me and James in the middle of a quiet conversation in the kitchen. "What's going on here?" Raymond asked, his tone sharp. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping away from James. "We were just talking." Raymond's eyes flicked between us, his expression hard to read. "Talking, huh?" James handled it better than I did, offering a quick explanation about helping Chloe with a project, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Despite the risks, we couldn't stop. Every touch, every kiss, every stolen moment only deepened the connection between us. It wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about the way he made me feel alive, seen, like I mattered in a way I hadn't in years. But the closer we became, the more I started to wonder how it would end. James had started talking about a future, about leaving everything behind and starting over somewhere new. "Come with me," he said one night as we lay tangled together on the couch. "We could make this work." I wanted to say yes, to believe it was possible. But the reality of what we were doing loomed over me like a storm cloud. "This can't last," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to let go. The cracks in our secret world were starting to show, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I always knew it would come to this. We were too reckless, too bold. I told myself we could keep it under control, but deep down, I knew the truth. Secrets like this never stay buried. The day it all unraveled started off like any other. Chloe had gone out for a yoga class, leaving the house quiet and still. James texted me in the morning, asking if he could stop by. I hesitated for a moment before typing back, just for a little while. When he arrived, the tension between us was already palpable. He kissed me the moment he stepped inside, his hands sliding to my waist as I tried half-heartedly to push him away. "Not here," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he murmured against my neck. "It's just us." But it wasn't just us. Not really. We ended up on the couch in the living room, the same spot where everything had started. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt almost mocking, illuminating the space that had become our secret world. I was too distracted, too caught up in him, to hear the sound of the front door opening. "Mom?" Chloe's voice froze me in place. James and I sprang apart, but it was too late. Chloe stood in the doorway, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't come. "Chloe," James started, stepping toward her. "Don't," she snapped, holding up a hand. "Don't you dare." Her eyes shifted to me, and the betrayal in her gaze was like a knife to the chest. "How long?" she demanded. "Chloe, it's not." "How long?" she repeated, her voice breaking. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. It just happened. I didn't mean for this to." "You didn't mean for this to happen?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "Are you serious right now?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked between me and James. "You're my mother. How could you? How could both of you?" She didn't finish. She dropped her yoga mat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, suffocating. "I should go after her," I said finally, my voice shaking. James grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not forceful. "Give her some time," he said softly. "She hates me," I whispered, tears blurring my vision. "She doesn't hate you," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Chloe didn't come home that night. She didn't answer my calls or texts, and by the next morning, I knew she'd gone to stay with Evelyn. That was when the second blow came. Evelyn called me late that afternoon, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "She told me everything," she said. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my stomach twisting. "Evelyn, how could you?" She interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "How could you do this to her? To yourself?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said weakly. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "You betrayed her. You betrayed me. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I didn't answer. What could I say? "I can't do this, Lorraine," she said after a long pause. "I can't stand by and watch you ruin everything. Don't call me again." The line went dead. The fallout came fast and hard. Chloe didn't just cut me out of her life. She went out of her way to make sure everyone knew what had happened. She told my colleagues, my friends, even some of my clients. The whispers started almost immediately, followed by the polite but pointed phone calls, canceling appointments. James wasn't spared either. Chloe contacted his law firm, letting them know about the affair. The details she provided were enough to get him suspended from his internship, and I could see the strain on his face every time we talked. "This is my fault," I said one night as we sat in his car, parked on a quiet street. "No," he said firmly. "This is our fault. Don't take all the blame." But I couldn't shake the guilt. The breaking point came a week later. James showed up at my house, his face pale and drawn. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, gesturing between us. "It's tearing everything apart. Chloe hates me. Your life is falling apart. And now my career." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe we should take a break. Give things time to settle." His words felt like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, knowing he was right. "Okay," I said quietly. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he was gone. I was left with nothing but the ruins of what we'd built. Chloe didn't come home, Evelyn didn't call, and James disappeared from my life as quickly as he'd entered it. The house felt emptier than ever, and for the first time, I wondered if it had all been worth it. The silence in my house was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. Chloe's laughter, Evelyn's weekly check-ins, James's quiet knock on the back door. All of it was gone. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. The days blurred together. I went through the motions, waking up, making coffee, sitting at the dining table, while the morning light poured in. My phone stayed silent, save for the occasional notification about missed appointments or canceled clients. Evelyn had made good on her promise to cut ties, and Chloe didn't respond to my texts or calls. I thought I'd feel relief with James gone, but the space he left behind only made the emptiness worse. Weeks turned into months. I sold a few more houses, mostly referrals from people who hadn't yet heard the whispers about me. I poured myself into work, hoping it would distract me from the mess I'd made. But every quiet moment was a reminder of what I'd lost. One night, I sat in bed scrolling through old photos on my phone. There were pictures of Chloe from her college graduation, her beaming smile as she held her diploma. Pictures of me and Evelyn at some wine tasting event, laughing as we clinked glasses. And then there was James. The few photos of him were innocuous, group shots at family dinners, a candid of him helping Chloe set the table. But even in those pictures, I could see it. The way he looked at me. I put the phone down, closing my eyes. I wanted to hate him for what we'd done, for the chaos he'd brought into my life. But I couldn't. A letter came in the mail one gray, rainy afternoon. It was handwritten, the envelope plain and unassuming. I knew it was from him before I even opened it. Lorraine, I've thought about writing this for weeks, but I wasn't sure if I should. I wanted to give you space to let you heal. But I can't stop thinking about you. I don't regret what we had. Not for a second. You made me feel alive in ways I didn't know were possible. But I know I hurt you, and I know I hurt Chloe. I can't undo that, but I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. I'm in Chicago now, starting over. If you ever want to talk, or anything else, you know where to find me, James. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it on the table. My chest ached with a mixture of longing and guilt. The next day, I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I reached Chloe's name. My finger hovered over the call button, my heart pounding. I pressed it. It rang twice before going to voicemail. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "It's me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I hope someday you can forgive me. I love you." I hung up, tears streaming down my face. James's letter stayed on the table for weeks. I thought about writing back, about hopping on a plane to Chicago and seeing if we could pick up the pieces. But every time I reached for the envelope, I stopped myself. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. For now, all I could do was sit with the silence and try to figure out who I was, without him, without Chloe, without anyone. And maybe that was enough. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. It was one of those rare days when the house felt warm and peaceful. The silence wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I had just stepped out of the shower, the scent of lavender still lingering on my skin. Wrapped in a towel, I moved through my bedroom, thinking about the tasks waiting for me. The house always seemed to demand something: repairs, cleaning, endless small things to keep it from falling apart. Maybe that's why I'd finally agreed to let Liam stay for the weekend. He'd offered to help with the long list of chores I'd been putting off. And truthfully, I was grateful for the company. Liam had a way of filling the house with energy, his presence a welcome distraction from the quiet loneliness that had settled into my life after Paul passed away. I reached for my clothes, pulling on a simple button-down shirt and a pair of jeans. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror that I realized something. I'd forgotten my bra. I sighed, shaking my head at my absent-mindedness. "One more thing to fix," I muttered to myself, crossing the room to grab it from the laundry basket. Just as I turned, the door creaked open. "Hey, Meredith." Liam's voice broke through the quiet as he stepped into the room. His words trailed off as he froze in the doorway, his eyes widening slightly. Time seemed to stop. For a brief moment, neither of us moved, the air between us heavy with surprise. I could feel the heat rush to my cheeks as I clutched the shirt tighter around me, my heart pounding in my chest. "Liam," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Sorry," he stammered, his face flushing as he quickly averted his gaze. "I didn't realize you were, I was just looking for the toolbox." "It's in the garage," I managed, my voice steady despite the embarrassment burning through me. "Right. The garage," he repeated, backing out of the room so quickly that he nearly tripped over his own feet. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the silence. I stood there for a moment, my hand clutching the fabric of my shirt as I tried to process what had just happened. It wasn't as if he'd seen anything, I was fully covered after all. But the way his eyes had lingered, the flush in his cheeks, it was enough to send my thoughts spiraling into unfamiliar territory. Shaking my head, I quickly finished dressing, trying to push the moment out of my mind. It was nothing, I told myself, an accident. That's all. But as I made my way downstairs, I couldn't shake the image of Liam's startled expression, the way his voice had faltered. When I found him in the garage, he was crouched by the toolbox, his back to me. He seemed focused, but I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his movements were just a little too deliberate. "Found it?" I asked, my tone light as I stepped into the room. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression carefully neutral. "Yeah, just grabbing what I need for the window in the kitchen." I nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Let me know if you need any help." "I'll be fine," he said, his voice steady, though he didn't meet my eyes. I watched him for a moment longer before turning to leave. But as I walked away, I couldn't ignore the strange flutter in my chest, the feeling that something between us had shifted. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of chores and small talk. Liam worked on fixing the loose hinges in the kitchen, while I busied myself with dusting and organizing. We crossed paths a few times, each encounter brief but charged with an unspoken tension. At one point, as I handed him a glass of water, our fingers brushed. It was such a small thing, but the contact sent a jolt through me, my breath catching as his eyes met mine for just a moment too long. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "You're welcome," I replied, my own voice unsteady. By the time lunch rolled around, the house felt heavier, the silence between us filled with something I couldn't quite name. We sat at the table, the sound of forks against plates the only noise. Liam seemed more relaxed, but I couldn't shake the memory of the morning. His face when he'd walked into my room, the way his gaze had lingered just a second too long. I told myself it didn't mean anything. He was just being polite, just helping out around the house like he always did. But deep down, I knew better. Something had changed. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what it meant. The afternoon sunlight poured through the kitchen windows as I leaned against the counter, staring absently at the clock on the wall. Liam had just stepped out to grab more supplies from the hardware store, leaving the house quieter than usual. But even in his absence, the morning's events lingered in my mind, replaying with a clarity that made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was nothing, an accident, a misunderstanding. But no matter how many times I repeated the words, they didn't dull the memory of his expression, confused, startled, and something else I couldn't quite name. When the front door opened, I turned quickly, trying to compose myself. "Got what I needed," Liam called out as he walked in, carrying a small bag of tools. His easy smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and I wondered if he was just as unsettled as I was. "Good," I replied, forcing a lightness into my tone. "Let me know if you need any help." "I might take you up on that," he said, setting the bag on the counter. His gaze flickered to mine briefly before he turned his attention to the tools, but that brief glance was enough to send a familiar flutter through my chest. I busied myself with washing a few dishes, hoping the mundane task would steady my nerves. But the sound of Liam moving around behind me, the quiet rustle of his shirt as he worked, made it impossible to focus. "How's the kitchen window coming along?" I asked, breaking the silence. "It's stubborn," he admitted with a soft laugh. "But I'll get it fixed. Just needs a little patience." Something about the way he said the word patience made me glance over my shoulder. He was looking at me again, his expression thoughtful, as though there was more he wanted to say. For the rest of the afternoon, We worked side by side, tackling small projects around the house. Liam fixed the kitchen window, replaced a faulty light switch, and even helped me rearrange the furniture in the living room. At one point, as we lifted the coffee table together, my grip slipped and the edge of the table bumped against my hip. "Careful," Liam said, stepping closer to steady it. His hand brushed against mine, and for a moment we both froze. "Sorry," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "It's fine," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the space between us charged with something neither of us seemed ready to acknowledge. Later, as we worked on painting the trim in the hallway, I found myself stealing glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking. The way the light caught the curve of his jaw, the way his sleeves were rolled up to reveal his forearms, it all felt too intimate, too close. At one point he caught me looking, and his lips curved into a small smile. "Something on my face?" he teased. "No," I said quickly, turning my attention back to the paintbrush in my hand. "Just making sure you're doing it right." "Ah," he said, his tone playful. "Keeping me in line, huh?" "Someone has to," I replied, though my voice lacked the teasing edge I'd intended. By the time we finished for the day, the sun had dipped low on the horizon, casting the house in a warm, golden glow. Liam stood in the doorway of the living room, surveying our handiwork with a satisfied expression. "Not bad," he said, nodding toward the freshly painted trim. "We make a good team." "We do," I agreed, though my voice caught slightly. He turned to me then, his expression softening. "Thanks for letting me help," he said. "I know this place means a lot to you." "It does," I said, my chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "And I appreciate everything you've done. Really." For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence between us filled with something unspoken. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet intensity that had been building all day. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, I found myself thinking about Liam again. The way his hand had lingered on mine earlier, the quiet care in his voice when he spoke to me. It all felt too deliberate to ignore. When he joined me on the porch, a beer in hand, the tension between us was palpable. "Long day," he said, sinking into the chair beside mine. "Yeah," I agreed, my voice quiet. For a while we just sat there, the sound of the waves filling the silence. But even in the quiet, I felt the air between us shift, as though we were both waiting for something to happen. "Meredith," he said finally, his voice low. "Yes?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the neck of his beer bottle. I'm glad I'm here," he said, his tone careful. "Me too," I replied, though my chest tightened at the weight of his words. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I found myself leaning back in my chair, letting the cool night air wash over me. But even as I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed, and I didn't know if I was ready to face what came next. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, the house still quiet with the faint hum of the ocean outside. I sat on the edge of my bed, running my fingers through my hair as the events of the previous day lingered in my mind. Liam's presence had always been comforting, but now it felt different. Charged, like an unspoken current was passing between us. When I finally made my way downstairs, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing by the stove, flipping pancakes, his back to me. The smell of coffee and syrup filled the air, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. "Morning," I said, my voice softer than usual. He turned, his smile lighting up his face in a way that made my chest tighten. "Morning. Hope you're hungry." "I didn't realize you could cook," I teased, moving to pour myself a cup of coffee. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he said, his tone light but carrying an edge of something deeper. We sat at the small kitchen table, the morning sunlight casting golden streaks across the wood. The pancakes were fluffy and sweet, the kind of breakfast that should have been comforting. But the silence between us was heavy, weighted with everything unsaid. "Any big plans for today?" Liam asked, breaking the quiet. I shrugged, taking a sip of my coffee. I was thinking about tackling the garden. "The weeds are getting out of control." "I'll help," he offered immediately. "You don't have to," I said, though a part of me wanted him to insist. "I want to," he said, his gaze meeting mine. There it was again, that quiet intensity, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a second too long. My pulse quickened, and I looked away, focusing on the plate in front of me. We spent the morning outside, pulling weeds and trimming overgrown bushes. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. It should have been an ordinary day, but every small interaction between us felt magnified. At one point, as I reached for a stubborn vine, Liam stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me, my breath catching in my throat. "Sorry," he said, his voice low. "It's fine," I murmured, though my chest felt tight. For the rest of the morning, I found myself hyper-aware of him. The way his shirt clung to his back as he worked, the soft laugh that escaped him when he found an old garden gnome buried in the dirt. By the time we finished, the sun was high in the sky, and we were both covered in dirt and sweat. "You look like you've been wrestling with a bear," Liam said with a grin, gesturing to the streak of dirt on my cheek. "Speak for yourself," I shot back, though I couldn't help but laugh. "Here," he said, stepping closer. "Let me." Before I could protest, he reached out, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. The gesture was so soft, so unexpectedly intimate, that it stole the breath from my lungs. "There," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I said, my words barely audible. We stood there for a moment, the space between us shrinking as his hand lingered just a little too long. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing. And then, as if realizing he'd crossed a line, Liam stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll grab the hose," he said quickly, turning away. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small, charged moments. Every glance, every accidental touch felt like a spark, igniting something I couldn't quite control. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam suggested a walk on the beach. "It's been a long day," he said, his smile soft. "We deserve a break." I hesitated, the thought of being alone with him making my pulse race. But I nodded, slipping on my sandals and following him out the door. The beach was quiet, the only sounds the gentle crash of waves and the distant cry of seagulls. We walked side by side, our steps in sync, the cool sand soft beneath our feet. "Thanks for letting me help out this weekend," Liam said, breaking the silence. "You don't have to thank me," I replied, glancing at him. "You've done more than enough." "I don't mind," he said, his voice steady. "I like being here. With you." The sincerity in his tone made my chest tighten, and I looked away, my gaze fixed on the horizon. We stopped at a small cove, the setting sun casting golden light across the water. Liam turned to me, his expression serious. "Meredith," he began, his voice low. "Yes?" I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said finally. "But I feel like something's changed between us." I looked at him, my breath catching at the vulnerability in his eyes. "It has," I admitted softly. The words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. "What do we do about it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. Liam took a step closer, his hand reaching for mine. I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever this is, whatever it means, I'm here." His words were like a lifeline, grounding me in a moment that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't know what this is either," I admitted. "But I don't want it to stop." Relief washed over his face, and he squeezed my hand gently. "Then we won't stop," he said. As we walked back to the house, the unspoken tension between us felt lighter, replaced by a quiet understanding. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But as the stars began to appear in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what came next. The storm had rolled in suddenly that evening, thick clouds blanketing the sky as rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the quiet of the house. Liam had offered to help me secure the patio furniture earlier, and now we stood in the living room, damp from the rain, our breaths uneven from the rush to get back inside. "Some storm," he said, running a hand through his wet hair. "Yeah," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. The room was dim, lit only by the warm glow of a lamp in the corner. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the tension building between us, an unrelenting force that neither of us seemed able to ignore. "You should change out of those clothes," I said, my words coming out too quickly, too sharp. Liam glanced down at his soaked shirt and jeans, a small smile playing at his lips. "Probably a good idea," I'll grab something dry from my bag. He started toward the stairs, but then paused, turning back to look at me. Meredith, are you okay? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I'm fine, I said finally, though my voice wavered. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer before he turned and disappeared up the stairs. When he returned, wearing a dry shirt and sweatpants, I was still standing in the living room, staring out at the rain streaking down the glass. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air heavier, and I could feel his presence even before he spoke. Meredith, he said softly, his voice closer than I expected. I turned to find him standing just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. I feel like something's been building between us, he said, his tone careful but firm. And I don't think we can keep pretending it's not there. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath catching as his words hung in the air. Liam, I know it's complicated, he interrupted gently, but I can't keep ignoring how I feel. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and I felt my walls begin to crack under the weight of it. How do you feel? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I can't stop thinking about you, he admitted, stepping closer. Like every time I'm near you, it's harder to hold back. His words sent a shiver through me, and I took a step back, my emotions warring between fear and something far stronger. This isn't right, I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. Why not? He asked, his voice quiet but firm. Because it's unexpected? Because it doesn't fit into some neat little box? I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Because it scares me, Liam. Me too, he admitted, his voice softening, but that doesn't make it any less real. The room felt impossibly small, the distance between us shrinking as he stepped closer. I don't want to push you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I need you to know how I feel. I care about you, Meredith. More than I should, maybe, but I can't help it. My breath caught, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Liam, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was gentle, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my hands reaching for his. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted, my voice trembling. Neither do I, he said, his fingers lacing with mine. But I know I don't want to stop. His words broke through the last of my resolve, and in the next moment his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as though we were both afraid of crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, the unspoken tension between us finally giving way to something raw and undeniable. The storm outside faded into the background, the sound of the rain and thunder replaced by the steady rhythm of our breathing. Liam's hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself lean into him, my own hands sliding up to rest against his chest. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Truly, fully alive. And while the fear still lingered at the edges of my mind, it was drowned out by the warmth of his touch, the certainty in his kiss. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to steady ourselves. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice shaky. Maybe it does, he said, his hands still resting on my waist. But maybe that's not a bad thing. I nodded, though the weight of the moment made it hard to speak. We'll figure it out, he said softly, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. Okay, I said finally, the word a quiet promise. We spent the rest of the evening sitting together on the couch, the storm outside continuing to rage. Liam didn't press for more, and I was grateful for his patience, his understanding. As the hours passed, I found myself leaning into him. His arm wrapped around my shoulders, his presence steady and reassuring. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel so empty. And as I drifted off to sleep, my head resting against his chest, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The morning after the storm, the world outside was still and quiet, the ground damp from the night's rain. I woke up on the couch, the faint scent of coffee wafting through the air. For a moment, I didn't move, letting the memories of the night before settle over me like a blanket. Liam's kiss, the warmth of his arms, the way everything had felt so impossibly real. When I finally sat up, I found Liam in the kitchen, his back to me as he stood by the stove. He was making breakfast again, his movements unhurried and precise. Morning, I said softly, stepping into the room. He turned, a smile spreading across his face when he saw me. Morning, he replied, his voice warm. I wasn't sure when you'd wake up. I hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure of how to navigate this new dynamic between us. I didn't mean to fall asleep on you, I said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. I didn't mind, he said, his eyes meeting mine. I like having you close. His words sent a familiar flutter through my chest, and I looked away, focusing on the plate of pancakes he had set on the counter. Breakfast? He offered, his tone light. Sure, I said, sitting down at the kitchen table. We ate in relative silence, the air between us charged with the weight of everything that had happened. Liam seemed relaxed, but there was an intensity in his gaze every time his eyes met mine, as though he was waiting for me to speak first. When I finally set my fork down, I took a deep breath. About last night? I meant every word, he said before I could finish. I blinked, caught off guard by his directness. Liam, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I just need you to know that what happened, it wasn't a mistake for me. The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten, and I found myself reaching for my coffee just to have something to do with my hands. I don't think it was a mistake either, I admitted softly, my voice trembling. But that doesn't mean it's not complicated. I know, he said, leaning forward slightly, and I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now. I just want us to figure this out together. His words were so simple, so earnest, that they left me momentarily speechless. Okay, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of quiet moments. Liam fixing a loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen, me folding laundry in the living room. Every time our paths crossed, there was a quiet tension between us, an unspoken understanding that we were standing on the edge of something neither of us fully knew how to navigate. By the afternoon, the clouds had cleared, and Liam suggested a walk on the beach. Let's get out of the house for a while, he said, his smile easy. The fresh air will do us good. I agreed, slipping on my sandals and following him down the familiar path to the shore. The beach was quiet, the waves lapping gently at the sand. We walked side by side, the sound of the ocean filling the space between us. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. I was thinking about Paul, I said finally, my voice breaking the quiet. Liam glanced at me, his expression thoughtful. What about him? How he'd feel about this, I admitted, my chest tightening. About us. Liam stopped walking, turning to face me. He'd want you to be happy, Meredith, he said, his voice steady. That's all he ever wanted. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, my gaze fixed on the horizon. I don't know if I deserve that, I whispered. Liam reached out, his hand brushing against mine. You deserve to be happy, he said firmly. You deserve to feel alive. His words broke something in me, and before I could stop myself, I turned to him, my tears spilling over. I'm scared, I admitted, my voice trembling. I know, he said softly, pulling me into his arms, but you don't have to be. For a long moment we stood there, the sound of the waves crashing around us. Liam's arms were steady, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his gaze searching mine. Meredith, I love you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. I love you too, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. The confession hung between us, raw and unfiltered, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, it all seemed insignificant compared to the way he looked at me, the way his touch felt like home. He leaned in then, his lips brushing against mine, in a kiss that was soft but filled with everything we couldn't say. The world around us seemed to blur. The only thing that mattered was him. The warmth of his touch, the quiet certainty in his kiss. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as the reality of what had just happened settled over us. This changes everything, I whispered, my voice shaking. Maybe it does, he said, his thumb brushing gently against my cheek. But maybe that's not a bad thing. I nodded, though the fear still lingered at the edges of my mind. We'll figure it out, I said softly. Together, he promised. We spent the rest of the day walking along the shore, talking about nothing and everything. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I reached for Liam's hand, lacing my fingers with his. Whatever came next, we would face it together. The days that followed felt like stepping into uncharted waters. The house was the same, the chores were the same, but everything between Liam and me had shifted. There was an ease between us now, an understanding that didn't need words. And yet, beneath that ease, there was still a current of uncertainty, a quiet fear of what might happen next. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Liam and I sat on the porch, our chairs angled toward the water. The waves crashed softly against the shore, their rhythm steady and comforting. He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "I think so," I said honestly. "Thinking about tomorrow?" Tomorrow, the day he would leave. The thought had been looming over me all day, a weight I couldn't shake. "I don't want this to end," I admitted softly, my eyes fixed on the horizon. "It doesn't have to," he said, his thumb brushing lightly against the back of my hand. "I'll come back, Meredith, as much as you'll let me." I turned to him then, my heart aching at the sincerity in his gaze. "You mean that?" "Every word," he said, his voice firm. It's not just a passing thing for me. I want to be here with you." The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice, was enough to steady me. The next morning, the house felt quieter than usual as Liam packed his bag. I stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching as he folded his clothes with practiced precision. "Do you have to go?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He paused, his hands stilling over the zipper of his duffel bag. "You know I'll come back," he said, turning to face me. "I know," I said, though the thought of him leaving still made my chest ache. He crossed the room in 2 quick strides, his hands finding mine. "This isn't goodbye, Meredith," he said softly. "It's just, see you soon." When it was time for him to leave, we stood by the front door, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. "Drive safe," I said, my voice trembling. "I will," he promised, his eyes never leaving mine. He leaned in then, his lips brushing softly against mine in a kiss that was tender but filled with quiet urgency. "Call me when you get there," I said as he pulled back. "Of course," he replied, his thumb grazing my cheek one last time before he stepped outside. I watched as he climbed into his car, the engine rumbling to life. He gave me one last look, his smile soft, before he drove away. The house felt emptier without him, the quiet stretching long and thin. I busied myself with chores, cleaning the kitchen and folding laundry, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him, his voice, his smile, the way his presence had filled the space so completely. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, the phone buzzed in my hand. "I'm home," Liam's text read. A wave of relief washed over me, and I quickly typed out a reply. "Good, I miss you already." The weeks that followed were filled with late-night phone calls and messages that made my heart race. Liam kept his promise, visiting as often as he could, and each time he walked through the door, the house felt brighter. Warmer. But as much as I cherished those moments, there was still a part of me that worried. What would people say if they knew? What would they think? One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I voiced my fears aloud. "Do you think this can work?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam turned to me, his gaze steady. "It already is," he said simply. His words stayed with me long after the sun had set, a quiet reassurance that helped me push past my doubts. Over time, the fear began to fade, replaced by something stronger, hope. I stopped worrying so much about what others might think, and started focusing on what made me happy, what made me feel alive. And Liam, his laughter, his kindness, his unwavering presence, made me feel more alive than I had in years. One evening, as we walked along the beach hand in hand, I looked over at him, my heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," I said softly. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "For being here," I said, my voice trembling. "For making me feel like I can breathe again." He stopped walking, turning to face me. "You don't have to thank me, Meredith," he said, his hands cupping my face. "You've given me just as much." The kiss that followed was soft, unhurried, and full of promise. A quiet reminder that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a quiet sense of peace settle over me. Our journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because with Liam by my side, I knew we could face anything. Together.